There is a certain kind of voice that doesn't rely on language in the traditional sense, and yet it finds its way into the very center of you, long before you are fully awake, long before your eyes meet the light, long before your thoughts have even gathered the will to speak. It arrives silently, but never gently. And though it doesn't shout, it claims territory like something ancient and practiced, like a shadow that knows this ground better than you do. What makes it dangerous is not its volume, but its familiarity. It speaks in patterns you've heard before, in half-truths that sound almost reasonable, in memories that feel too personal to question. It begins, perhaps, as just a flicker of a thought, one you might mistake for your own, but it carries an edge, a weight that doesn't belong to peace. You find yourself remembering things you didn't plan to remember, revisiting rooms in your mind that you thought were long since closed. And as the images return, they don't just bring the past, they bring judgment, shame, and a quiet, persistent question. What if you had done things differently? This is how it begins, not with fear or rage, but with suggestion. The kind of suggestion that seems innocent until it becomes an accusation. The kind of whisper that doesn't need to shout because it waits for you to agree. It doesn't tell you that you're unworthy. It simply reminds you of the moments when you felt that way. And then it watches as you take the rest of the journey yourself, reliving every mistake, explaining to no one what you wish you had done instead, and trying to make sense of something that cannot be undone. There is no need for the enemy to build a prison when you have already begun to fashion one in your thoughts, brick by brick, from guilt and doubt and the softest form of despair, the kind that doesn't scream but lingers. Jesus called him a thief, not because he always arrives with violence, but because he prefers to enter quietly, through doors we forget to guard, at hours when we are most vulnerable, when we are not yet dressed in the armor of the morning.
It took me time, too much time, perhaps, to realize that I was not simply waking up tired, but waking up invaded. My mornings were not empty, they were occupied, filled with thoughts that had been whispered into the silence before I even knew the battle had begun. And yet I kept blaming myself, thinking I was just overthinking, just reliving the past out of habit, not knowing that this pattern had been rehearsed by someone who studies the soul more closely than we dare to admit. And then, one morning, I remembered something else. A time when waking felt light, when my first breath of the day didn't carry sorrow, when the morning belonged to God, and peace felt like a natural part of being alive. I couldn't recall the exact moment when that changed, but I knew it had. Somewhere along the way, I stopped praying before the voices arrived, and they took that silence as permission to speak. But silence is never neutral. What we leave unguarded does not remain empty. And I began to understand that the only way to keep the whisper from returning was not to fight it when it comes, but to speak before it does. To speak with the voice of prayer, not in panic or desperation, but as one who understands that the soul must be covered in truth before the morning even begins. So now I wake not with words of defense, but with words of invitation, not to the voice that accuses, but to the one who restores. I say it not with urgency, but with reverence. Lord, place your hand over my mind before the first light touches my face. Let your peace be the first voice I hear. Let your truth take up the space where lies once lived. Because I have learned this much. When God is already present in the room, the enemy does not enter through the window. And when the first voice you listen to speaks love, every other voice fades into the distance where it can no longer reach you.
There is a moment, often quiet and unnoticed, when the mind turns backward, not by choice, but by habit, as if something hidden inside us keeps walking down a hallway that never ends. This corridor is long, lined with echoes, and lit by memories that refuse to stay where they belong. It begins innocently, sometimes with a photograph, a smell, or a song that was never written for sorrow and yet somehow leads us to it, again and again. We don't always intend to return. Sometimes it happens in the middle of doing something else, when we're washing dishes or folding clothes, or standing in traffic with nothing but our thoughts to keep us company. And then, without warning, we are there again, not in our bodies, but in our minds, standing in front of a moment that hurt us, or a choice we wish we had made differently, watching it unfold exactly as it did, unable to change a single detail, yet unable to look away. It's strange how the mind can become a place of captivity, not because we are chained by something external, but because the past, once invited in, rarely leaves without taking something with it. And this is where the enemy becomes fluent, almost poetic in the way he plays the record. He doesn't need to invent anything new. He simply lifts the needle and places it on the same part of the song, the part where the pain was sharpest, where your voice shook, or your silence cost more than you realized at the time. And while the melody plays, he begins to narrate. He speaks with calm certainty, asking questions that don't sound like accusations, but leave you feeling smaller with every breath. What kind of person would have done that? How could you say that to someone you loved? Do you really believe you've changed if you still remember this with tears? It is not an argument he wants, it is agreement. Quiet, unspoken consent that, yes, perhaps you are defined by that moment. Perhaps you will always be that person in the hallway, watching your own failure from a distance that never seems to grow. But I have come to see something else in that corridor. Something I didn't notice at first because regret can be so loud that it drowns out everything but itself. I began to see that memory is not the enemy, and the past, though unchangeable, is not the place where God resides. He is not in the moment you broke or the hour you fell. He is in the hand that reaches into that memory and says, "Come out, child. This is no longer your home."
And yet, it is hard to leave, not because the past is beautiful, but because it is familiar. There is a strange comfort in returning to what we understand. Even when it hurts, the pain becomes a routine, a pattern we repeat, because at least it is ours. But the truth, the uncomfortable, liberating, holy truth, is that we were not made to carry what has already been forgiven. We were not designed to wake each day with yesterday's sorrow as our first companion. There is no redemption in reliving what has already been laid at the feet of Christ. There is no healing in punishing ourselves for wounds He already bore. And yet we walk again and again through that corridor, not because we must, but because we haven't yet believed that the door out has been open the whole time. The enemy wants you to feel alone there. He wants you to think that this is what holiness looks like, reliving your failure, punishing yourself, proving your sorrow through suffering. But God does not dwell in that theater. He speaks from outside the door, and His voice is not full of shame, but of welcome. He doesn't say, "Explain yourself." He says, "Let it go. Let me carry what you cannot." So I began to practice something new. Each time the corridor called, I stopped at the threshold. I did not enter. I did not replay the moment. Instead, I whispered what I wish I had known years ago. This memory does not own me. My name is not written in that regret. My story is not trapped in that moment. I am more than what I remember. And slowly, like light entering through stained glass, the presence of grace began to filter into the place where sorrow had lived. It did not come with thunder or fanfare, but with stillness, the kind that speaks louder than accusation ever could. And in that stillness, I could finally hear it. The past had stopped echoing because I had stopped walking its halls. Now, when regret rises, I remind it gently, not with anger, but with peace, that the blood of Christ speaks louder than the voice of memory. And when the enemy lifts the needle to play that old record again, I no longer give him the silence he needs to begin. I fill the room with gratitude. I name the mercies I have seen since that day, and I return to the present, where grace still holds my hand. Because the corridor of regret has many doors, but only one leads out, and its name is truth.
There is a kind of fear that does not arrive with evidence in its hands, but instead with stories, carefully crafted, quietly exaggerated, completely believable because they are constructed from the same material as the mind itself. It does not enter as a storm, but as a thought, small, quiet, reasonable. It begins with a question that never waits for an answer. It starts with, "What if?" and ends with silence that somehow sounds like truth. I have known this fear well, not the kind that stands before danger and responds with instinct, but the kind that invents danger and convinces you it's already real. It is not a reaction to a thing, but a rehearsal of what might become a thing if everything goes wrong in exactly the right sequence. It is a long, slow erosion of peace, not because something happened, but because the mind prepared for it so many times that the body learned to feel the weight of sorrow for a day that never arrived. When I was a child, there was a cemetery near my walk to school. It was not especially large or frightening, and nothing had ever happened there. But I remember how my feet would quicken when I passed it, and how the air felt colder, even in the summer, as if the presence of death had rearranged the temperature of my thoughts.
I remember praying faster, gripping the straps of my backpack as if fear could be carried away by holding on to something physical. No one chased me, no hand reached from the grave, no whisper came from the stones, and yet I was terrified. And now, as an adult, I've come to see that the cemetery never really left. It simply changed shape. It became the phone call I haven't received yet, the diagnosis that hasn't been spoken, the loss that hasn't occurred, the empty chair at a table that is still full. It became the shadow of absence cast by the possibility of pain. And I carried it, sometimes without knowing, like a secret weight sewn into the lining of my coat. The enemy doesn't need to create disaster. He just needs to make you imagine it. Because once the mind rehearses a tragedy, the heart begins to feel it. And once the heart feels it, the soul begins to grieve. This is the grief of imagined futures, the mourning of things that have not been lost. And in that grief, the enemy finds his home, not because he delights in your pain, but because he delights in your disconnection from the peace that was meant to be yours.
We spend our energy fortifying ourselves against scenarios that only exist in our imagination, preparing speeches for arguments that will never happen, blaming ourselves for outcomes that are still distant possibilities. We breathe faster, sleep less, hold tension in our shoulders and call it normal. But what we call normal, heaven calls unnecessary. Jesus spoke clearly, not with poetic metaphor, but with the weight of command. Do not worry about tomorrow. He did not offer it as advice, but as freedom. He knew what we forget, that worry multiplies itself. It teaches the mind to loop, to circle, to rehearse fear like a song we hate but cannot turn off. And the more we listen, the more familiar it becomes, until silence itself feels like a danger we must fill with concern. I have learned that peace is not something that descends from the sky. It is something we protect, something we preserve by refusing the invitation to fear what hasn't happened. The enemy cannot steal peace. He can only convince us to trade it away. And most of us don't even notice we've handed it over until the day feels heavy and we cannot name the reason why. I began to pray differently when I understood this. I stopped asking God to take away the fear, and I started asking Him to replace the imagination it feeds on. I asked Him to paint the pictures of tomorrow with His hands, not mine, to fill my inner world with promises rather than probabilities. And slowly, the unknown began to feel like a place of wonder again, instead of a field of traps waiting to be triggered. Because the truth is, the worst things rarely happen the way we imagine them, and the best things often arrive unannounced. And if I am going to spend my limited thoughts on what doesn't yet exist, I would rather fill them with hope than dread. Now, when the fear begins to form, not with logic, but with feeling, I recognize it like an old photograph that no longer looks like me. I pause, I breathe, and I whisper, not loudly, but firmly, this is not truth. This is not prophecy. This is not God's voice. And just like that, the silence begins to shift. not all at once, not with thunder, but with a returning stillness, the kind that reminds me that today, this moment, this breath, is the only ground I've been asked to stand on. And on that ground, there is no shadow, only light.
There are conversations that never took place, and yet they shape us more than the ones that did. They unfold entirely within the quiet theater of the mind, cast in shadow, lit by assumption, and performed with characters whose faces we know, but whose words, in truth, we never heard. These dialogues are not spoken, yet we remember them. We carry them, rehearse them, believe them. And before we even realize what has happened, we are living in response to a script no one else ever agreed to. It begins with a glance that felt slightly off, or a delayed message that left too much space for interpretation. It begins with silence, not always painful, but long enough to invite imagination. And imagination, when shaped by past wounds, rarely creates mercy. It builds entire worlds out of pauses, tones, and gestures, assigning motives and meaning where there was only ambiguity. We begin to write the lines for others, to hear their voices in our own heads, repeating phrases they never said, echoing judgments they never spoke. And the more we listen, the more convincing the dialogue becomes. A friend doesn't answer a call, and suddenly the mind says they're avoiding you. Someone chooses a different seat at the table, and the heart whispers they didn't want to be near you. A compliment feels too rehearsed, a smile too brief, and in those tiny details, suspicion begins to bloom, not as a loud accusation, but as a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, something is wrong with how we are seen, how we are loved, how we are held in the hearts of others. Bitterness rarely begins with betrayal. It usually begins with interpretation. And when interpretation is shaped by fear, or pride, or wounds still tender from years before, it becomes a lens that distorts the present into a replay of the past. We stop hearing what is said and start responding to what we think is meant. We stop asking, "What did they say?" and begin declaring, "I know what they meant." And from that moment on, dialogue ends. Relationship begins to unravel not from action, but from internal narration, the story we tell ourselves about what people think of us, without ever letting them speak for themselves. There is a deep loneliness that grows in that kind of silence. A person can be surrounded by others, can serve faithfully, love generously, and still feel alone. Not because no one sees them, but because they have come to believe that every glance is a judgment, every correction is rejection, every pause is proof of disapproval. The enemy does not need to isolate you with conflict. He only needs to convince you that you are already separate. And once you believe that, your heart will begin to build walls no one can see, and you will start defending yourself against a danger that never entered the room. I have lived inside that silence. I have answered questions no one asked, defended myself in arguments no one started, and apologized in the quiet of my soul for offenses that existed only in my imagination. I know what it is to feel exhausted by relationships that have never spoken a single unkind word, simply because I carried suspicion like a shield, expecting to be misunderstood even before the conversation began.
And the more I listened to that inner theater, the harder it became to hear anything else. But healing began when I chose to question the script, when I paused long enough to ask, did they truly say that? Or have I allowed my own fears to fill in the silence? I began to discover that many of my emotional wounds were not caused by what others did, but by what I believed they thought. And that belief, untested, unspoken, unchallenged, had become a fortress of loneliness, protecting me from a pain that might never have come, and in doing so, keeping me from love that was already waiting.
God does not speak through accusation. He does not whisper suspicion into our ears. His voice is not vague or manipulative. It is clear, honest, gentle, and it always invites restoration, never resentment. So I began to ask him to clear the stage in my mind, to silence the conversations that never happened, and to replace them with his voice, the one that always speaks truth, always calls me beloved, always calls me out of hiding. Now, when the inner script begins again, when the enemy starts handing me lines to read, I stop and breathe, and I choose deliberately to wait for the real voice. I choose to ask instead of assume. I choose to believe that love is not as fragile as my fear makes it seem. And slowly, the walls I once built with my own imagination begin to crumble, not through force, but through clarity. Because the most powerful truth I have learned is this: not every silence must be filled. Not every pause means distance. And not every imagined offense deserves a reply. Some things are better left unspoken, not because they don't matter, but because they were never true to begin with.
The mind, like any living thing, does not remain neutral. It responds to what we give it, consumes what we place before it, and grows in the direction of its nourishment. We often think of thoughts as visitors, coming and going, passive, harmless. But over time, I've learned that they are more like seeds. Left untouched, some decay, some vanish. But the ones we return to, the ones we water with repetition, attention, and emotion, those are the ones that take root, whether we mean them to or not. It took me years to realize that most of the heaviness I carried in my soul did not come from external pressures, but from a slow, consistent diet of small negativities. Not dramatic failures or catastrophic losses, just little thoughts fed daily. I would listen to complaints, dwell on offenses, replay minor frustrations until they became major. I believed I was being realistic, grounded, discerning. But what I was actually doing was training my soul to recognize pain as familiar and joy as foreign. The more I focused on what was broken, the more everything seemed cracked. The more I repeated bitter conclusions, the more they became beliefs. And what's worse, I thought I was being wise. I thought that cynicism was a sign of depth, that sarcasm meant insight, that noticing what was wrong made me more spiritual. But there is a thin, almost invisible line between discernment and discontent. One protects the soul, the other poisons it slowly.
I remember a season when I was serving faithfully, surrounded by good people, walking through days that were not easy, but certainly not tragic, and yet I felt numb. Not angry, not in crisis, just dull, as though joy had been reduced to a memory, and gratitude felt like something I had to perform, not feel. I couldn't understand why I was so depleted, until one day, in the quiet, I asked myself, what have you been feeding your soul? The answer came not as a revelation, but as an inventory. I had been feeding myself the language of complaint, rehearsing grievances, sharing frustrations in the name of honesty, dwelling on imperfections in others and disguising it as concern. I was reading things that made me angry, watching things that made me tired, listening to voices that drained more than they gave. And somehow I expected to feel whole. The soul, it turns out, cannot thrive on scraps of beauty and buckets of bitterness. It needs more than just a break from darkness. It needs light. It needs truth, sung, not shouted, whispered, not weaponized. It needs reminders of goodness, not just warnings about evil. It needs to hear that hope is not naive and that tenderness is not weakness. And none of that can grow when all the soil is soaked in the language of cynicism. I began slowly, not by silencing all criticism or pretending everything was fine, but by noticing what I reached for without thinking. What I read when I was tired, what I spoke about at the table, what kind of stories I shared, what kind of humor I repeated. It was not about rules or guilt, but about hunger. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized how starved my soul had become for grace.
So I made a choice. Not a dramatic one, not a loud one, just a daily one. I began to feed my thoughts with words that pointed upward. I placed scripture where the news used to be. I reached for music that quieted my spirit instead of inflaming it. I practiced gratitude until it felt sincere again. I asked God not just to renew my mind, but to help me protect what He was planting in it. And something began to shift. Not everything changed. People were still difficult. Days were still long. Moments of sadness still arrived without warning. But the weight I carried began to feel lighter. Not because life was easier, but because I was no longer feeding the heaviness. Peace, I found, is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of proper nourishment. When I filled my mind with words that healed, with images that reminded me of beauty, with prayers that didn't fix but simply connected, I changed. Quietly, deeply. And what grew inside me was not perfection, but resilience. Not the absence of negativity, but the presence of something stronger, more rooted, more real. Now, when I feel the old hunger returning, the one that craves complaint, that wants to gossip, that leans toward bitterness, I pause. I ask, will this feed the life I want to live? Will this grow what is good in me? Or will it nurture what I have already asked God to remove? Because the soul is not neutral. It does not drift toward light on its own. It needs intention. It needs tending. It needs truth, again and again and again. And what you feed, that is what you will become.
There is a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It does not arrive with urgency or drama, and it doesn't require an audience to prove its presence. It settles slowly, like fog at dawn, like dew forming on the edges of forgotten leaves. It grows in the quiet places, in the hours no one sees, in the stillness before anything has begun. And though it may look small from the outside, it becomes, over time, the strongest thing a person can carry, because it is built in prayer. I used to wait for the war to begin before asking for help. I would let the thoughts rise like a tide, try to reason with them, try to fight back once I was already knee-deep in their weight. My mind became a battlefield where I was always reacting, always trying to regain ground that had already been taken. And though I prayed, I often did so from exhaustion, not preparation, as if prayer were a rescue rope thrown after the fall, not a bridge built before the storm. But there came a moment, not marked by crisis, but by fatigue, when I realized I could not keep defending myself with scattered words and last-minute strength. I needed something sturdier, something that did not depend on how I felt, something that would hold even when I was too tired to hold it. And so I began to build something different, not with my hands, but with my habits. I began to pray early, not just early in the morning, but early in thought, before the first voice had a chance to rise, before memory had a chance to stir, before fear began to whisper. I placed a prayer between me and the noise. It wasn't elaborate, it wasn't poetic, but it was honest. And over time, it became something more than words. It became a wall.
Guard my mind, Lord. Guard it before I even know what to guard against. Set a watch over the gates of my thoughts. Let no lie enter without your interruption. Let no fear rise without your voice standing in its way. And though it was simple, it became consistent. I prayed it like breathing, not out of fear, but out of faith, that what begins with God does not unravel when darkness tries to press in. And something changed, not all at once, not with fire, but quietly. Thoughts that once arrived unannounced began to hesitate. Lies that once found quick entry began to falter. The silence that used to belong to the enemy began to feel inhabited, as if someone else had arrived ahead of the fear, ahead of the weight, ahead of the storm. The wall was not visible, but it was real, and it was not made of certainty, but of surrender. I did not build it by knowing all the answers, or by pretending to be stronger than I was. I built it by returning again and again to the one who already knew what I could not see, the one who was never caught off guard, the one whose voice had always been stronger than my fears, but waited patiently for my invitation. Because that is what prayer is at its heart. Not a performance, not a checklist,
not a magic spell against suffering, but an invitation into the places we cannot control, into the thoughts we cannot tame, into the mornings we cannot predict. Prayer builds what the mind alone cannot construct: a resting place, a shield, a stillness that stands even when the world shakes.
And now, when I feel the early stirrings of unrest, not loud but familiar, I do not wait to see where they lead. I turn to the wall. I lean against the strength I did not build alone. I whisper the words again, not because God has forgotten, but because I need to remember that protection is not something I must earn. It is something I am invited to receive. I have stopped treating prayer like a reaction and started treating it like a foundation. I no longer wait to fall before calling for help. I speak before I stumble. I reach before I am lost. And though some may call that weakness, I have found it to be the source of every strength I now carry. Because the mind is not just a battlefield, it is a gate, and what enters it shapes what we become. But when that gate is guarded by the presence of the one who speaks peace before chaos even dares to speak, then no voice, no shadow, no whisper, no lie can make its way through. And so I pray, not because I am strong, but because I know where to find strength. Not because I fear the war, but because I've learned it is better to build before the storm arrives. The wall is built one prayer at a time, and over time, it becomes a home.
There comes a moment, not marked by applause, not framed by triumph, when something shifts inside, almost imperceptibly, like the quiet tilt of the earth that brings morning before the sun is even seen. It is not loud, it does not arrive with certainty, but it is real. A soft realization that the weight you once carried no longer sits where it used to. That the noise that once filled your mind now waits outside the door instead of inside your chest. You do not feel victorious, you simply feel whole. Peace does not always come in the way we imagined. It does not conquer the storm with thunder, nor silence every thought with final answers. It comes more like light filtering through leaves, like warmth after a long season of chill, like a breath you didn't know you were holding, finally let go. It does not erase the past. It does not promise that sorrow will never return, but it changes the way sorrow finds you. It changes the room in which pain knocks. It changes the voice that answers. When the mind is no longer a battlefield, it begins to bloom. You notice things again. The texture of silence, the way kindness sits on someone's face, the beauty of small, ordinary moments that used to pass unnoticed because you were too busy defending yourself from invisible enemies. The garden begins to return, not because you forced it, but because you stopped allowing fear to trample the soil. And the voice of God,
once drowned beneath layers of inner chaos, begins to speak again. Or maybe it never stopped. Maybe you just became still enough to hear it. It does not speak in commands or condemnation. It speaks in welcome, in invitation, in the language of restoration. This space is safe now. You don't have to run anymore. I am here and I am staying.
I have come to believe that this is what healing really looks like. Not perfection, not silence, but presence. The presence of peace where war once lived. The presence of beauty where shadows once ruled. The presence of a God who does not demand we be unshaken, but who stands with us until the shaking ceases. And maybe that is the greatest miracle of all. Not that the thoughts are gone forever, but that they no longer own you. Not that fear never returns, but that it no longer decides who you are. Not that the enemy stops whispering, but his voice no longer finds agreement. So now, when I rise in the morning, I do not expect the absence of challenge. I expect the presence of God. I do not brace for impact. I prepare to receive. I greet the silence not with fear, but with faith that what waits for me in the quiet is no longer accusation, but communion. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different kind of living. One where joy is not borrowed from circumstances, but grown from within. One where love is not a reward for performance, but a gift that waits every morning with hands outstretched. One where grace is not the exception, but the atmosphere. And if something in this journey has stirred your heart, if even one line made space for your soul to breathe, then I ask only this: let someone else feel it too. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but for the one person still waking up in the dark, wondering if they're the only one who hears the noise. If this touched you, share it, like it, comment, not for applause, but so the thread remains open for someone else to find. Let them know they're not alone. And now, before we part, I say this with all sincerity. May peace find you early. May the light return gently. And may your mind become a garden again, not empty of thought, but full of grace.